Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It just happens to be Little Blue Book numbered 112, and it is titled The Secret of Self-Development, written by John Cowper Powys. And let's see if there's a copyright. I'm not sure. I don't remember. Let's look. Oh yeah. One moment. This Little Blue Book is copyrighted 1926, and it is The Secret of Self-Development. And here we go. The art of self-culture is the art of acquiring and then of widening and deepening a certain attitude toward life. This attitude, just because of its flexibility and malleability, is hard to define, and its external expression will be found to vary in different epochs and localities. But in spite of all this, there is, throughout human history, a sufficient similarity of type and identity of tradition to make it possible to indicate this mysterious open secret, and to analyze, though within fluctuating and wavering margins, its nature and its quality. What the Chinese classics call a superior man is a human being possessed of an attitude toward life which can even now, though in vague terms, be outlined, and this would also apply to the wise man of Plato and Aristotle, and with a certain difference to the man of virtue, the virtuoso of the Renaissance. Such an adept in the art of self-culture would doubtless in India be more metaphysical, in Japan more artistic, in Germany more learned, in England more aristocratic, in France more critical, in Russia more impassioned, in America more unprejudiced and eclectic. But behind such a person, whatever his local bias might be, there will always be found the accumulated weight of a great secret tradition, carried down through all the ages and through all the countries, which remain intrinsically human and universal. This open secret of the art of self-culture must of necessity overlap, and indeed exploit and be exploited by, many other high and rare human values. It will have its own peculiar relation to human goodness, to human science, to human happiness, its own peculiar relation to religion, to the obligations of economic necessity. But while its orientation overlaps these fields and gathers material from them, it remains in its own essential nature detached and uncommitted. Self-culture can, in other words, be given nobler and finer edges by its commerce with goodness, tougher and stronger roots by the pressure upon it of practical necessities. But even as it thickens or rarefies itself by appropriating these things, it instinctively protects itself against them when they seek to weaken and submerge it. Any self-culture whose attitude to simple human goodness is cynical, whose escape from economic necessity is ignorant and contemptuous, becomes by degrees a self-culture divorced from those deep natural wellsprings of life, which are the given material of all philosophy and all art, and without which all subjective impressions tend to run thin and wayward and morbid. The master current in all true self-culture is and always has been the poetic view of things, and one has only to recall how large a measure of the poetry of Homer, of Dante, or Shakespeare, of Goethe, is concerned with good and evil, with earth-bound economic necessity, to recognize that any aesthetic cult which remains contemptuously aloof from these recurrent issues is a cult that has lost touch with the true poetic attitude of mind. Self-culture is completely justified in holding aloof from the popular catchwords and popular manias of the hour, but it cannot hold aloof from the difference between good and evil, between intelligence and stupidity, between justice and injustice, without losing contact with those dramatic elements of poetic contrast which give to all the subtler in, intimations of life their poignancy and distinction. Thus, true self-culture, although frequently languid and impassive in questions of topical propaganda, is never really antinomian. That is to say, it is never oblivious to the difference between good and evil, between sensitiveness and insensitiveness, between nobility and ignobility. Nor is it an attitude dependent upon the felicity of any privileged or leisured advantage. Some of the most clairvoyant of its visions of the magical beauty of life have originated in the intervals of monotonous labor. Thus we see Charles Lamb copying East Indian cotton ledgers, Joseph Conrad folding the rudders of ships, Spinoza polishing lenses, Matthew Arnold visiting schools, Cervantes playing soldier. And though we must admit that leisure to feel, to experience, to contemplate, to discriminate is something that culture must, by hook or crook, steal from life, it is certain that the more culture a person has, the more cunning does he become in stealing unscrupulously, from employer, from business, from family, from friends, the few precious moments of independence from which he knows well enough how to squeeze the most exquisite drops of immortal nectar. The supercilious contempt for their burden of mechanical work, which laborers of all sorts are sometimes aware of in the attitude of cultivated persons, is so far from being a sign of real culture as to be a sign of its extreme opposite, vulgar superficiality. The deeper a person's real culture sinks, the more does he become aware of the tragic poetry of common humanity, staggering forward, baffled, blinded, thwarted, yet undefeated, under the burden of its demure toil. But what lends so often a semblance of justification to that sense of something precious, flickering, affected, unnatural, which plain people so often feel in the presence of cultivated people, is the fact that such persons, culture remains external to their real life. It is in fact the final and supreme test of culture, this bringing it into touch with the brutal pressure of reality. Nor is such a mental adjustment at all an easy achievement. A man leaves his books, plunges into the turbulent stream of the world, and behold, life is altogether a different thing. It prods him and scrapes him and harrows him with a raw harshness, a rank flippancy, a crude purposelessness, such as seems to have no counterpart at all in that mellow air and gracious order which reign in his world of books. The fact is that with most educated and intelligent people, there is a vast gulf between their life in the world and their life in culture. They do not differ very much in this from the simple uneducated people who turn frankly to a literature that is not literature, just as they do to the movies or to the radio, solely in order to escape from the tedium of their real existence. Such an example is most excellent wisdom and a thrilling comfort. But if culture can do no more than delicately refine upon such drugs as these, it remains only skin deep. What real culture does, culture that has got into a person's blood and bones, is materially to change his whole attitude toward the pressure of this raw reality. Frequently this change takes the unpleasant form of making him loathe such reality, loathe it with a loathing indescribably more desperate than that simple sense of tedium and weariness with which the uneducated turns away to his various melodramatic Nephilies. Nephiles? Yeah, Nephiles. Such culture, in the true sense, does not by any means necessarily make for pleasure or comfort. Sometimes it makes for suicidal misery. Wonderful. In this, it resembles love, religion, and all the great gestures of the human race. For the truth is that what we call self-culture is simply a heightening of the self-consciousness in us. Under its influence, we grow more sensitive and more imaginative. Our happiness gathers subtly in volume. So also does our misery. Self-culture is not a pursuit of goodness, nor is it a pursuit of truth. It is our human response for that mysterious aspect of the universe which we call beauty. And this beauty, this magical essence which rises like an exhalation, like a fragrant smoke from all the processes of life, is in itself an absolute. This implies that our response to it, however wavering and fluctuating and however dependent upon our wayward moods, has also something about it which partakes of the nature of an absolute. By an absolute, I mean something the value of which is beyond all utilitarian or practical criteria. Something which might be useless, purposeless, and even fatal, and yet something which carries with it its own complete justification. Self-culture is the heightening and deepening of our human sense of this absolute, whatever it is, that the universe reveals. Thus, though our sense of the beauty of things, when intensely cultivated, so often enhances our sense of the brutality and hideousness of things, an obstinate and inveterate instinct in us hinders us from wishing to be otherwise, hinders us from pining for those simpler levels of sentiency which we have left behind. The art of self-culture, therefore, since its aim is to make us more sensitive and more imaginative in the presence of the universe, is obviously defeated if, as soon as we leave our books to encounter the raw pell-mell of existence, we drop the whole pretense and just bustle and blunder on, taking the bull by its horns, saluting life at its face value, accepting the world at the world's own estimate. The traditional apparatus of culture, poetry, music, sculpture, painting, history, philosophy, has, according to my view, failed entirely to achieve its end. If, when in presence of the huge chance-driven spectacle of life, raw, littered, and disordered, we simply convert ourselves into patient beasts of burden till the tyranny of the day is over. The art of self-culture is the art of gathering up in the depths of our being some sort of sagacious, cunning, or secretive energy by means of which all this raw, chaotic debris shall be forced to yield certain apricus, a lovely magic, shall be forced to reveal certain fleeting intimations of this hidden absolute. Beauty of some kind is there. Let me read that again. Beauty of some kind is there. Punctuation. Not very good in the 1920s. Beauty of some kind is there. No menchical readjustments of the elements of the earth. No herding and standardizing of humanity can prevent this eternal mystery from rising up, strange and lovely, from off the surface of the most shocking repulsiveness. But to deal with the raw facts of life in this selective way is a most difficult thing. A person has to sink deep for the power and the cunning to achieve it. Indeed, anything less like the luxurious affections of the aesthete of popular fancy than the type of human character thus evoked could hardly be imagined. The procession of the seasons as it changes the countenance of the simple... Let me make sure I did that page. Yep. Didn't make sense there for a minute. The countenance of the simplest rural landscape, or the tamest city square, the actual living substances of trees, plants, clouds, leaves, and water, are enough in themselves for the mind that has made the great poets his companions, without their being necessary without there being necessary any recourse to scenes of exceptional or startling sublimity. Oh, yeah, sublimity. The true adept in the art of capturing the magic of the elements can find his fairylands forlorn upon any suburban wayside, by any patch of town greenery. Nothing short of some insane human cruelty can prevent the sun and the air from visiting every child of man out of their free sky, or stop the process across his heaven of the moon and the stars in their appointed visitations. To regard men and women, as you stumble casually upon them in ordinary encounters, from a viewpoint that disentangles the tragic fatality of their brief and troubled lives from the details of their cluttered surroundings, is to have arrived at a degree of self-culture beyond what any reading of Plato can bring. As long as there is an unbridged gulf between our emotions as we read and our emotions as we walk the pavement, but to ponder the thoughts of Plato until they mold one's actual nervous reactions to the great hurly-burly of the world, this is to read philosophy to good purpose. It is absurd to call that person cultivated, who becomes mean, vulgar, blunt, and brutal the moment he leaves his introverted dreaming over the books he loves. But right here we must not allow ourselves any illusion. The cultivated person has to earn his living, and he were a fool if he allowed his culture to interfere with his natural shrewdness in dealing with men and things. What he should aim at is an innocent Machiavellianism. Is an innocent Machiavellianism in these matters. Boy, that's really one of the rare times I've ever heard that word used in a sentence. Let him defend his secret thoughts. Why not? By the most wily genuflections, as he bows down in the house of Rimmon. Not sure what that's all about. He is earning his leisure to be a man by his cunning adaptability in the art of being a contented slave. If there is sin in this, let it be on the head of society. The individual's business is to save himself at all costs. The whole problem of culture lies in the sphere of the immediate reality which presses upon us. If culture does not assist us to wrestle with this reality, it is just a pleasant byplay and a slight importance for the baffled spirit of man. A waiter, a stenographer, a department store assistant, a factory worker, an office hand, is much more in need of a penetrating and delicate philosophy, of a subtle and distinctive taste, than a person of leisure who can hunt foxes and fish for trout. Self-culture is of little account if it cannot take the place of religion, of morality, of courage, of humor, and even of love itself. Consider the case of a man with a soul-withering job, a scolding wife, noisy and aggressive children, and a home in some city basement. What is the use, a cynic might say, of culture to such a man as this? Well, this is just the test. According to the only view of culture I can understand, a man in this position, superstitiously reading King Lear or Faust or the turning of the page is difficult, or the Inferno or Charles Lamb in hurried snatches on a hard chair between stove and window, struggling to summon up the right kind of ironic submission, the right kind of crafty evasion, the right kind of drastic formidableness for dealing with the situation in hand, without having recourse either to suicide or desertion, will be a man whose culture, whether it succeeds or fails, will be of the genuine and authentic quality, will, in other words, be an assault on the raw, crude, brute facts of life,
so as to draw out of them, willy-nilly, the nectar of the immortals. Self-culture is man's retort to the hard realities of the universe. True self-culture has as much iron and cunning and sagacity in its in it as a oh god in it as is possessed by the most unscrupulous worldly ambition. I have no idea why that sentence was so difficult to read. I'll blame it on the weed. It is used to squeeze out of this difficult and tough universe such celestial tasting drops of the magic of beauty as may redeem all our miseries. Every temperament will instinctively select its own intellectual weapons. I would say to a young man or a young woman anxious to use culture as a key to the secrets of life, read the great sagacious humanists who are at once profoundly reverential and profoundly skeptical. For they alone will indicate to you the nature of irony and the nature of poetry, which of all mortal qualities are the ones that enable us to deal most powerfully with the evasive mystery of life. And if such a young man or young woman asked me to name these humanists, from whom can be learned the secret of poetry and the secret of irony, I would mention the names of Homer, Euripides, Horace, Dante, Shakespeare, Goethe, Charles Lamb, Dostoevsky, John Keats, Matthew Arnold, Walter Pater, Joseph Conrad, and Marcel Proust. And I would give such a young person my sacred word of honor as a responsible student of life, that if they read nothing else but the writers mentioned above, not even bothering to read them in anything but translations, for the space of 3 years, they will by that time be in a position to take hold of these hard facts of life, as people call them, so as to treat them ironically and poetically. They will probably be less successful in their worldly ambitions as a result of this method of mastering reality, but they will not worry about that, as long as they have enough money to keep their peace of mind reasonably intact. The truth is, people have got a completely wrong idea of the nature of culture. They regard it as a luxury of the leisured, whereas it is as much of a necessity for everyone as is love. As a matter of fact, every human being is compelled by the pressure of the life urge itself to acquire some degree of culture. Culture is simply the name we give to a predetermined and calculated response to the mystery of life, when such a response is directed toward life as a whole, rather than toward any practical end. We can narrow our definition yet further by turning the page. We can narrow our definition further by saying that the aspect of life toward which culture directs itself is that aspect which may indiscriminately be called beauty or mystery or magic or even truth. For the first rudiments of the culture will be found to give us a shrewd hint that these so-called hard facts of life are a good deal less solid and less substantial than they appear to the unsophisticated eye. The most uneducated peasant or factory hand, if he has developed an original and sensitive response to life, is in reality more cultivated in the truest sense of that term than many a college-bred professor. And the more deeply cultivated a person is, the fewer will be the books he will read, for he will gather the great select spirits of the ages about him and meddle very little with contemporary fashions. He will carry the sonnets of Shakespeare in his pocket as he goes to his office. Secreted in his desk in his office itself will be found Bayard Taylor's translations of Faust, or Lang, Butcher, and Leif's translation of Homer. And, who knows, if on his way home he will not debouch down some side street to a second-hand bookshop and purchase There's some stray volume of Matthew Arnold's poetry. I am inclined to think that one definite result of such a person's concentration upon the great humanists of the world will be the development in him of a certain philosophical skepticism, which will be turned just as frequently upon the latest dogmas of science as upon the oldest dogmas of religion. I am inclined to think that although he will love to skim over the gnomic pages of the great metaphysicians, he will treat each peculiar thinker rather as an artist than as a discoverer of pure truth. I think he will visualize his hard facts for a month or so, shall we say, according to the vision of Hegel, and then, for another month, transform them according to the vision of Spinoza or of Schopenhauer. And I think we'll stop there for part one of Little Blue Book number 112, The Secret of Self-Development by John Culpeper Powys. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in part two.